I lost $480,000. And the strangest part is that I can still tell you the exact day I had all of it. December the 2nd. I remember because I'd done my quarterly review that morning, the way I always did, coffee going cold beside the laptop, and the number at the bottom of the spreadsheet was the biggest it had ever been. $481,412 and some change. I took a screenshot of it. I actually took a screenshot, like a man photographing a fish he'd caught, and I sent it to nobody, because there was nobody to send it to, and then I closed the laptop and went out for noodles. 11 months later, I was sitting in a lawyer's office in the old city, and the number on the page in front of me was less than 9,000, and I understood for the first time in my adult life that I had no idea how money actually worked. Not the math of it. The math I understood. I mean the part underneath the math, the part nobody teaches you, the part that has nothing to do with how much you earn, and everything to do with who can reach it. I want to tell you this story properly, from the start, because the way it usually gets told is wrong. People hear a number like that and they assume there must have been some dramatic moment, some heist, some single catastrophic decision a smarter man would never have made. There wasn't. That's what I need you to understand before anything else. There was no heist. There was no moment. There was just a slow, quiet, perfectly ordinary leak in a structure I had built myself, with my own hands, out of laziness and trust and a deep, stupid belief that distance was a form of safety. The money didn't get stolen from me in the way you're imagining. It got stolen from me the way water gets out of a cracked tank. Not all at once, not in a way you'd notice on any given Tuesday, just continuously, patiently, until one day you go to the tank and it's empty, and you realize it's been emptying the whole time you were congratulating yourself on owning a tank. So let me start with who I was, because the man matters more than the money here. My name is Scott. I'm 59. For most of my working life I built and ran a small e-commerce business. Nothing glamorous. Mostly outdoor and camping gear, the kind of stuff that sells steadily and never makes you famous. I started it in a spare room in 2009, and by the time I was 55, it was throwing off enough that I could mostly step back. That was always the dream, you understand. Not yachts, not anything like that. The dream was a laptop and a good internet connection, and the freedom to wake up anywhere on Earth and have the money keep coming in regardless. I'd read all the books. Location independence, the 4-hour week, geographic arbitrage, which is a fancy way of saying you earn in dollars and spend in a currency that respects you. I believed in all of it, and to be fair to the books, a lot of it was true. The part that wasn't true, the part none of those books ever mention, is what happens to the human being on the other end of that freedom. They tell you how to detach from the location. They don't tell you what happens to a man who detaches from everything. I should say something about the years before, because they explain why the freedom mattered so much to me, and why I was willing to pay so dearly to protect the feeling of it. I grew up in a house where money was a constant low-grade emergency, the kind that never quite explodes, but never quite goes away either. A leak in the ceiling that you learn to put a bucket under and stop seeing. My father worked himself into an early grave for a wage that never once got ahead of the bills, and the lesson I took from watching him, the lesson I built my whole adult life around, was that the worst thing in the world was to be trapped. Trapped in a job, trapped in a place, trapped under a pile of obligations you couldn't see the top of. So when I finally built something that ran on its own, that didn't require me to be anywhere, that meant I could close the laptop and walk out the door, and the money would keep arriving regardless, it wasn't just a business to me. It was the opposite of my father's life. It was proof that I'd escaped the thing that killed him, and you do not look closely at the thing you believe has saved you. You don't audit your own salvation. That's the psychology underneath all of it, and I didn't understand it for a second at the time. There was a marriage in there too, an early one, that ended for the ordinary reasons marriages end. Two people growing in different directions over 15 years, until the gap is too wide to shout across. I don't blame her, and she doesn't blame me, which is its own kind of sad, but it left me, at 50-something, alone in a way I'd never planned for, with a successful business, and an empty apartment, and a calendar that belonged entirely to me, which sounds like freedom and feels, after the first few months, like a very quiet room you can't find the door out of. I tell you this not for sympathy but because it's relevant. A man who is alone, who has money, who has trained himself not to look closely at things, and who is quietly aching for someone to make his life feel like it's going somewhere. That man is not a victim waiting to happen. That's too passive. That man is a structure waiting to fail, walking around on two legs, and I was that man, and I'd have told you to your face that I was the most sensible person I knew. I came to Thailand in the spring of that year, more or less by accident. A friend from the old forums had set up in Chiang Mai and wouldn't stop talking about it, and I had no reason to be anywhere in particular, so I came. And I'm not going to pretend it wasn't wonderful, because it was. Chiang Mai in those first months was the closest thing to contentment I'd ever felt. The pace of it, the food, the way the mountains sit behind the city in the morning like they're keeping an eye on things. I rented a place up in the Nimman area, which is where a lot of people like me end up. The cafes full of laptops and the smoothie bowls, and the slightly self-satisfied hum of people who've all decided they're cleverer than the lives they left behind. I fit right in. I told myself I'd found it. The arbitrage. The freedom. The thing the books promised. And here's the first thing I want you to notice, because it's where the crack started, long before there was any person to blame for it. I had a business that ran in dollars, customers and suppliers and platforms all somewhere else. And now I had a life that ran in bought, rent, and food and a whole set of local realities that the dollar machine knew nothing about. Those two things needed a bridge. They needed someone, or something, sitting in the middle, moving money from the world where it was made into the world where it was spent, handling the paperwork that a foreigner can't easily handle, dealing with the bank that doesn't want to deal with you, registering the small local entity that the law more or less requires. And I, in my infinite wisdom, decided that the bridge should be a person, and that the person should handle all of it, and that I should know as little about the details as possible, because knowing the details was exactly the kind of friction I'd come here to escape. I want to be very precise about this because it's the whole story in miniature. The fatal thing was not who I hired. The fatal thing was that I designed a role whose entire purpose was to stand between me and my own money, and then I went looking for someone to fill it. Her name was Fern. She was 28, an accountancy graduate from a decent local university, sharp in a way that was obvious within about 90 seconds of meeting her. I'd put out word that I needed someone to manage the local side of things, set up the Thai company that a few of my supplier relationships were starting to require, handle the local bank account, deal with the bookkeeping and the tax filings, and the small army of forms that a foreigner running anything here has to feed continuously or starve. She came recommended by an accountant I'd used for a one-off filing, and in the interview she did something none of the others had done. She asked me how I actually wanted to live. Not how I wanted the books done, how I wanted to live. And when I said I wanted to not think about any of it, she nodded like that was the most reasonable thing in the world, and she said, in careful, precise English, that her whole job would be to make sure I never had to. I hired her that afternoon. I want you to hear how that sounds. I hired the person who promised me I'd never have to look, because never having to look was the thing I wanted to buy. For a long time, and this is important, because it's the part that makes it work, she was excellent. Genuinely, measurably excellent. The company got registered without me lifting a finger. The local bank account, the thing a foreigner can spend 3 frustrating months failing to open, materialized in 2 weeks. The bookkeeping was immaculate. Every month she sent me a clean 1-page summary. Revenue in, expenses out, the local balance, the dollar accounts she could see but not touch, all reconciled neatly against the spreadsheet I kept myself. For the first year, maybe a bit more, I checked her numbers against mine fairly closely, the way you do with anyone new, and they always matched. Always. And here's the thing about a number that always matches. Every time it matches, you check a little less carefully the next time. Trust isn't a decision you make once. It's a thing that accumulates, quietly, every time nothing goes wrong, until one day, You're not checking at all, and you can't even remember deciding to stop. She had a family, of course. Everyone does. Hers was middle class, perfectly ordinary, parents outside the city, and a younger brother she clearly adored. The brother was the kind of detail that I now understand mattered enormously, and that I waved away completely at the time. He was bright, she said, accepted into a good program at a university down in Bangkok, and the fees were a stretch. She mentioned it the way people mention these things, not as a complaint, just as a fact of her life, the ordinary weather of a family with one foot up the ladder, reaching back to pull the next one along. I remember thinking it spoke well of her. A person who carries her family is a person with a backbone, I told myself. I was, in my own mind, hiring a quality of character. What I was actually doing was installing a permanent, undisclosed financial pressure directly into the one position in my entire life that touched all of my money and answered to none of my attention. I saw a virtue. I should have seen a vector. Now, the second year. This is where I gave away the last thing I had, and I gave it away so casually that I genuinely cannot remember the conversation, which tells you everything about the state of mind I was in. The local operation had grown. There were more suppliers to pay, more small recurring local costs. A part-time warehouse arrangement Fern had set up that was, by every measure I could see, saving me money. And every payment, every transfer, every signature on every form, still needed me. Or rather, needed my authorization, which I was providing remotely, sometimes from another country entirely, with all the attention of a man swatting flies. I was, by then, traveling a fair amount, a few months back in the States, a stretch in Vietnam, the whole point of the exercise life I'd built. And the authorizations were a drag. They were friction. They were the one piece of the machine that still required me to look, and I had spent the better part of 2 years training myself not to look. There had been a warning, by the way. I want to put it here, in its proper place in the timeline, because it lands harder when you see how early it came and how completely I dismissed it. There was a man I knew from the cafe circuit up in Nimman, an older expat named Walter, a retired auditor of all things, who'd been in the country 15 years and had the weary, unbothered air of a man who'd seen every version of every mistake. We were having a beer one evening, early on, when I was still proud of how smoothly I'd outsourced the local side of things, and I told him about Fern, about how brilliant she was, about how I never had to think about the money anymore. And he didn't react the way I wanted him to. He went quiet for a moment, the way old auditors do, and then he asked me a single question. He asked who checked her work, and I said she did. She handled all of it. That was the whole point. And he put down his beer and looked at me with something close to pity, and he said, slowly, like he was explaining gravity to a child, that the person who handles the money and the person who checks the money can never be the same person. That this was the first thing they taught you, the oldest rule there was, that it had nothing to do with whether you trusted anyone and everything to do with what you were exposing yourself to. And I did the thing I always did. I told myself my situation was different. I told myself Walter was a paranoid old bean counter who'd spent too long looking at fraud and had started seeing it everywhere. I told myself that Fern had earned my trust, that the numbers always matched, that bringing in a second person to check her would be insulting and expensive and exactly the kind of friction I'd come here to escape. I had the answer handed to me, free, over a beer, by a man who'd spent his career on precisely this problem, and I waved it away because it required me to admit that my freedom had a flaw in it. $300,000. That's what the beer cost me in the end. The cheapest advice and the most expensive refusal of my life. So I made her sole signatory. On the local accounts, all of them. I told myself it was a delegation of authority, the kind of thing any sensible business owner does once an employee has proven herself. And on paper that's even sort of true. But that's not what it was. What it was, in plain language, was this. I removed the last point in the entire system at which my own eyes were required to pass over my own money. I took the bridge between my dollars and my life, the bridge I'd built a person to be, and I removed the toll booth. From that day forward, she could move money out of the accounts without me, without my signature, without my knowledge, without my attention being required at any point in the process. And I did it to save myself the bother of clicking approve on a phone. I need to stop here, because this is the lesson, and everything that follows is just the lesson playing out at length. The danger was never her. I have to keep saying that, because the easy version of this story makes her a monster and makes me a victim, and that version is a lie that will get you robbed exactly the way I got robbed. The danger was the structure. I had created a position with 3 properties, and any one of them is a manageable risk, but all 3 together are a loaded gun pointed at your own bank account. Property 1. The person in the role had total operational control, and I had near total operational ignorance. Property 2. There was no independent check on her work, no second set of eyes, no auditor, no reconciliation done by anyone but her, because the whole point of hiring her had been so that I never had to do it myself. And property 3. She had a standing, undisclosed, growing financial pressure in her personal life that the role's design did absolutely nothing to detect or relieve. Control, no oversight, motive. You give those 3 things to a saint, and you're still gambling. You give them to an ordinary human being, under ordinary strain, and you are not the victim of a crime so much as the architect of an opportunity. I built the opportunity. She walked through the door I left open. Both of those things are true, and you need to hold both of them, or you'll learn nothing. The first time something was wrong, I didn't see it, because I'd designed a system specifically so that I wouldn't. But it was already happening. I can reconstruct it now, with the lawyer's documents in front of me, and I can tell you almost to the month when it started. It started small. It always starts small. The brothers' fees came due, that first big lump, and somewhere in there a transfer went out of the company account that shouldn't have, dressed up in the books, as a supplier payment to a vendor that existed but that I never dealt with directly, and so never thought to question. A few tens of thousands of baht. A rounding error against the scale of the business by then. And here is the genuinely chilling part. The part that I think about at 3 in the morning. She put it back. That first time, she put it back. Within the quarter, the money returned to the account. The books balanced. My 1-page summary arrived clean as ever, and I noticed nothing, because there was nothing to notice. The system had been tested and the system had passed, which is to say the system had failed in the only way that matters, silently, leaving every visible surface intact. That's the thing nobody warns you about. The first theft that gets repaid isn't a theft you caught. It's a rehearsal you missed. She learned, in that first quarter, that she could move my money and return it, and that I would never know either had happened. She learned that the gap between what the book said and what I checked was wide enough to drive a life through. And once a person knows that, not suspects it, knows it, has tested it, the question stops being whether and becomes only how much and how long. I have no way of knowing what she told herself in that period. Maybe she meant only to borrow. Maybe the first repayment was sincere, and the slide came later. I'm not in the business of reading her soul. What I can tell you for certain is that the structure made the slide effortless, and a structure that makes the wrong thing effortless will, given enough time and enough pressure, produce the wrong thing. Not because people are evil, because pressure plus opportunity plus zero friction is a recipe, and recipes work. It went on like that for a long time, longer than I can quite believe even now. The pattern matured. The supplier payments to vendors I never spoke to grew a little larger and a little more frequent. A second local account got opened, entirely legitimately on paper, to handle the warehouse and the part-time staff, and that account became the real machine, the one the money moved through on its way out, because I never looked at it at all. It had been created for operations I'd explicitly chosen not to think about. The 1-page summaries kept coming, kept being clean, because they were drawn from a reality she controlled completely. I want to be fair to the version of me that was living through this, because he wasn't a complete fool. Once or twice a year some small thing would snag. a balance lower than I'd have guessed. A summary that arrived a week late. A quarter where the local expenses seemed high relative to the activity I knew about. And every single time, there was an explanation. And every single time, the explanation was plausible. Because it was delivered by the one person on earth who knew exactly which explanations I'd accept. The exchange rate had moved. A big annual fee had landed. A supplier had required prepayment. I'd nod, and I'd feel briefly responsible for having even asked, and I'd go back to not looking. Each of those moments was a door, and behind each door was the whole truth, and I shut every single one of them myself, gently, from the outside. I want to give you a sense of the texture of those middle years, because the abstraction of it, control, no oversight, motive, makes it sound like a diagram, and it wasn't a diagram, it was a life, full of small pleasant moments that all, in retrospect, did quiet work to keep me from looking. We were friendly, Fern and I, in the easy professional way of people who work well together across a distance. She'd send me photos sometimes, the warehouse, a new supplier's samples, a festival happening outside the office, little texture from the local world I'd outsourced to her. When I was in town, we'd occasionally get lunch and go over the business, and she was good company, funny in a dry way, genuinely knowledgeable about the operation in a manner that made me feel I'd hired brilliantly. And I had, in a sense. That's the cruel part. She really was that good. The competence was real. That's what made the rest of it invisible. You don't go looking for fraud in your most reliable system. You go looking for it in the thing that's already wobbling. The thing that runs perfectly, which means, is the last place you'll ever check. Which means, if you understand the structure of it, that the thing running perfectly is precisely the place a smart person hides the leak. There's a memory I keep returning to, from maybe the middle of the second year, that I think captures the whole thing. I'd flown in for a few weeks and we were sitting in a cafe up in the Nimman area, the laptop between us, going over the quarterly numbers. And there was a line, a payment, a few tens of thousands of baht, that I didn't recognize, and I asked about it, idly, not suspicious, just curious. And she explained it instantly, completely, with a small supporting detail about a supplier's deposit terms, and the explanation was perfect, and I remember actually feeling a little flush of guilt for having asked, as though I'd implied something about her I hadn't meant to imply. I remember apologizing. I apologized to her for glancing at my own money, and she waved it off graciously, and we moved on, and I felt, leaving that cafe, that I'd been reassured. I had been reassured. That's the trap closing. Right there, in real time, over iced coffee. The reassurance is the trap. A system that makes you feel foolish for checking is a system that has already decided what it's going to do to you. I think the reason I never pushed is the reason most people in my position never push. And it's worth saying plainly, because it's the real lock on the whole thing. To push, to actually demand the underlying statements, to bring in an outside accountant, to reconcile the bank's own records against the books she kept, would have meant admitting that the entire premise of my life might be wrong. I had built everything on the idea that I could be free of the details. To go looking hard at the details would have been to confess that the freedom was an illusion, that I'd been paying for the feeling of not worrying rather than for any actual safety, that the most expensive thing I owned was my own ignorance, and I'd been topping it up every month. That's a hard thing to look at. It's much easier to accept that the exchange rate moved, so I accepted that the exchange rate moved, year after year, while the tank quietly emptied. The thing that finally broke it wasn't cleverness on my part. I want to be honest about that too, because if I let you think I cracked it through some flash of insight, you'll go home thinking insight will save you. And it won't. Process saves you. Insight comes too late. What happened was that I changed one small thing in my own habits, almost by accident, and the small change did what 2 years of trust had prevented. I'd gotten a new accountant back in the States to handle my dollar-side taxes. A meticulous, slightly humorless woman who, for her own reasons, wanted to see absolutely everything, including the local Thai operation that my previous accountant had been happy to take on faith. She asked me, in the course of an ordinary year-end cleanup, for the actual bank statements from the local accounts. Not the summaries. The statements. From the bank, direct. It's such a small thing. It's the kind of thing that should have been happening from day one. And I want you to sit with how close I came to never doing it, because the only reason it happened at all was that a stranger in another country, with no stake in my feelings, asked a routine question that everyone closer to me had been trained, by me, not to ask. I forwarded the request to Fern, the way I forwarded everything, and for the first time in our entire working relationship, the answer didn't come back clean and fast. It came back slow. It came back with a small complication about the bank's online portal. Then a complication about a format the bank needed time to produce. Then a week of nothing. And something in me, some old instinct from the years when I ran every part of the business myself, woke up. I'd love to tell you I confronted her decisively. I didn't. What I did was quieter, and, in a way, worse, because it meant I already half knew. I went to the bank myself. I flew back to Chiang Mai. I went into the branch in person with my passport and my company documents, and I asked for the statements directly, going around the portal, going around her, going around the entire system I'd built to keep myself from ever having to do this. And I sat in a plastic chair in the corner of the branch while a teller printed out a stack of paper, and I started reading, and the floor of my life quietly dropped away. I'm going to slow down here, because this was the moment, and you deserve to understand exactly what it feels like, in case you ever find yourself in that chair. It does not feel like a revelation. It does not feel dramatic. It feels like reading. Just reading, line after line, the way you'd read anything. The first page was ordinary. The second page was ordinary. And then there was a transfer I didn't recognize, and I told myself it was nothing, and there was another, and I told myself it was the warehouse, and there was another, and somewhere around the fifth or sixth one, I stopped being able to tell myself anything at all, because the pattern was right there in front of me, month after month, a steady outflow to accounts and vendors that traced back, when I later had the lawyer pull the thread, to her family, to her brother's university, to a car, to a small piece of land outside the city, to the ordinary furniture of a life being built quietly with my money, while I congratulated myself on not having to look at the furniture catalog. I remember the air conditioning in that branch was too cold. I remember a child crying somewhere near the entrance. I remember thinking, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that I had done this to myself, and that the woman in the printouts was real, but the trap was mine. What I felt, sitting there, was not what I'd have predicted. I'd always imagined that discovering a thing like this would feel like rage, or like heartbreak, some hot and immediate emotion with a shape to it. It wasn't like that. It was cold and slow and almost clinical, the feeling of watching a diagnosis come back and understanding, before the doctor even finishes the sentence, exactly what every previous symptom had meant. All the small snags of the past 2 years rearranged themselves in front of me into a single clean line. The late summary, that 1/4, the balance that had seemed low, the explanation about the exchange rate that I'd accepted, because accepting it was easier than the alternative. They weren't separate events anymore. They were one event, stretched across 2 years, and I had been present for every minute of it, and had understood none of it, because understanding it would have required me to look, and I had built my entire life around the principle of not looking. I sat in that plastic chair for a long time. The teller asked at one point if I was all right. I told her I was fine. I wasn't fine, but what was I going to say? That I'd just watched my own freedom turn out to be the most expensive cage I'd ever paid for. The confrontation, when it came, told me everything I needed to know about how she'd survived inside the story she'd been telling herself. She didn't deny it. That surprised me. She was calm, almost relieved, the way people are when a long-held breath finally goes out of them. She told me her brother's fees had been impossible, that her family had been drowning, that she had always meant to put it back, that in the beginning she had put it back, and that somewhere along the way the gap had grown past the point where putting it back was possible, and so she had simply kept the books clean and the summaries clean and waited for a reckoning she'd somehow convinced herself might never come. She said she hadn't thought of it as stealing from me, exactly, because I had so much and noticed so little, because the money I never looked at had never seemed quite real to either of us. And the terrible thing, the thing I'm almost ashamed to admit, is that I understood her, not forgave. Understood, because she was describing, from the inside, the exact same trap I'd built from the outside. We'd both been telling ourselves that money you don't look at isn't quite real. I'd used that story to avoid responsibility. She'd used it to take everything I had. Same story. Two ends of it. The lawyer was kind, and the lawyer was useless. In that order, which is the worst combination. He went through the documents with me for a long afternoon, and at the end of it he told me what I already suspected, that almost none of it was recoverable. The transfers were, on their face, company payments authorized by the company's sole signatory, which she was, legally, because I had made her so, in writing, with my full knowledge, 2 years earlier, to save myself the trouble of a phone tap. The vendors that didn't quite exist were hard to prove and harder to chase. The car was in a relative's name. The land was in a relative's name. The money that had gone to her brother's education had become a degree, and you cannot repossess a degree. There were avenues, the lawyer said. There always are. There were criminal complaints I could file, civil actions I could pursue, years of process I could feed money into for the privilege of probably recovering a fraction of a fraction. He was honest enough to tell me that the cost of the fight would likely exceed the recovery, and that the only people guaranteed to come out ahead were the lawyers, of whom he was one, and he said even that with a kind of weary decency. I added it up that night, the way I'd added up everything my whole life, and the number at the bottom was less than $9,000 in accessible funds, against a business that had, 11 months earlier, been the proudest screenshot on my phone. I want to tell you what I lost, precisely because the precision matters, and because the easy version of this story always reaches for a round number, and the truth is never round. I lost the 480-odd thousand only in the sense that the structure that held it was compromised. In cold fact, the direct, traceable, provable diversions came to a bit over $310,000 across roughly 26 months. The rest, the difference between the screenshot and the wreckage, went to the long tail of trying to fix it. The lawyers, the accountants, the flights, the months of paralysis, where the business itself withered because the man running it was sitting in plastic chairs reading bank statements instead of doing his job, the suppliers who drifted away while I was distracted, the platform standing that decays the moment you stop tending it. A business is a living thing, and it dies of neglect even faster than it dies of theft. By the time the dust settled, I hadn't just been robbed of money, I'd been robbed of the machine that made the money, because while I was busy discovering the leak, I'd stopped feeding the engine, and the engine had cooled. I'll tell you something I've turned over a lot in the months since, because it matters to how you hear the whole thing. I went looking, eventually, for what the money had actually become, partly for the lawyer and partly for myself, and the answer wasn't villains' yachts and casino chips. It was a brother who's now a qualified professional with a degree he'd never otherwise have afforded. It was a modest house her parents live in. It was a small plot of land and a used car, and the unremarkable scaffolding of a family hauling itself one rung up the ladder. I'm not telling you this to excuse it. What she did was theft, sustained and deliberate, and dressed in clean books for over 2 years, and no amount of sympathetic backstory changes the line item at the bottom of my account. But I tell you because the cautionary tales always want the thief to be a cartoon, a cold-eyed seductress counting your money in the dark, and the truth is so much more ordinary and so much more useful than that. Ordinary people, under ordinary pressure, will do extraordinary damage if you hand them control without oversight. That's not a story about a bad person. That's a story about a bad structure. And you can't protect yourself from bad people. They're unpredictable. They come in every shape. But you can absolutely protect yourself from bad structures, because you build the structure, It's the one part of the whole thing that was ever actually in your hands. Rebuilding has been slow and unglamorous. I took a job, an actual job, consulting for a couple of small e-commerce outfits run by people much younger than me who think I'm wise because I've made mistakes they haven't gotten to yet. The irony of being paid for my judgment after what my judgment cost me is not lost on me, believe me. But here's the thing about hitting the bottom of the tank. You finally understand the tank. I'm good at this now, in a way I never was when I was rich, because I know, in my bones and not just my head, where the leak comes from. Every business I look at, the first thing I ask is the question Walter asked me. Who checks the money? And the number of times the answer is some version of, the same person who handles it, would terrify you. The trap I fell into isn't rare. It's everywhere. It's the default. Most people build it without noticing, the way I did. And most of them get away with it for years, the way I almost did. Right up until the quarter the pressure on the other person gets too high, and the friction on your side gets too low, and the recipe finally cooks. So where am I now? I'm 59, which is a hard age to start again, not because the body can't, but because the story you've told yourself about your life has set, like concrete, and you have to take a hammer to it. I'm still in Thailand, actually, which surprises people. I half expected to flee, to do the thing the cautionary tales always end with, the bitter departure, the last look at the place that ruined you. But I didn't. And the reason I didn't is the reason I'm telling you all this, instead of just nursing the grudge. Because it wasn't the place that ruined me. It wasn't even, in the end, the person. It was the design. And a design can be changed. That's the only piece of hope in this whole sorry account, and I'm going to hand it to you directly, so listen. The lesson is not, don't trust people. That's the lesson the bitter version of this story teaches, and it's worse than useless, because it's both false and unlivable. You cannot run anything, anywhere, without trusting someone, and a man who trusts no one simply gets robbed by his own paranoia instead, paying for protection he doesn't need, and missing the opportunities that trust unlocks. The lesson is not about who to trust, it's about structure. It's that trust without verification isn't trust, it's just exposure wearing trust's clothes. The single thing that would have saved me cost almost nothing and required no genius. A second, independent set of eyes on the money. Someone whose only job was to reconcile the bank's own records against the books, reporting to me and not to her, looking at the statements directly and not the summaries. Separation of duties, the accountants call it, and they call it that because it is the oldest and most boring and most reliable defense there is. The person who controls the money should never be the only person who watches the money. That's it. That's the whole secret. It is so simple that I'm embarrassed to have paid $300,000 to learn it. And there's a second lesson underneath the first, quieter and harder, and it's the one I actually think about most. I lost the money because I wanted, more than I wanted the money itself, to not have to pay attention. I had confused freedom with absence. I thought being free meant being able to look away, and so I built a life around looking away, and a life built around looking away will, sooner or later, be relieved of whatever you weren't looking at. Real freedom isn't not looking. Real freedom is being able to look at the truth of your own situation without flinching, and then deciding what to do about it. I never once looked without flinching. I flinched every time, and I called the flinch a lifestyle. If you're building something far from yourself, a business, an account, a whole life in a place where you don't speak the language and don't know the rules, and have decided that not knowing is part of the charm, I'm not telling you to stop. I built a good thing once, and the building of it was real. I'm telling you that the distance you're so proud of is not free. Every mile you put between yourself and your money is a mile someone else can stand in, and the only thing that makes that distance safe is a structure that watches what you've stopped watching. Build the structure first. Build it before you find the wonderful, competent, indispensable person who promises you'll never have to think about it again. Because the moment someone promises you that you'll never have to look, That is the precise moment you can no longer afford to stop looking. I know that now. I knew it the whole time, really. I just wanted the fantasy more than I wanted the truth. And the truth, being patient, simply waited for me by the bottom of the tank.